I think we can get that better. Yeah. Welcome! I'm your host, the wandering fantasy author Jay Requard, and this is the second season of Pondering the Orb. We're back with a new setup, a new format, but the same focus on wonderful books in the genres of epic fantasy and Sword-And-Sorcery, as well as the best of melodic death metal and synthwave. But before we begin, please click and subscribe below, and click on that notification bell. Let's do old book, new book. Our old book strains today's convention to be called a novel, and much mystery surrounds whether or not Robert E. Howard is to be credited with the full authorship when it first appeared in Weird Tales of May in 1939. Either way, ALMURIC walks the line between the sword-and-sorcery genre he helped originate and the planetary weirdness of his contemporaries like Lovecraft and Burroughs. All part science fantasy, our hero S.R. Karn is sent to the planet ALMURIC after he's deemed unfit for earthly society, but once there, sets about surviving, thriving, and ultimately coming to ally with the native Guruk peoples in the war against the winged Yagas. What sets this narrative apart is Howard's distinct use of first-person point of view to communicate the story of his main protagonist. This novel is much more introspective than one might suspect, and deserves a read considering how quick it is. Let's read a bit from ALMURIC by Robert E. Howard. Esau Cairns Narrative, Chapter 1. The transition was so swift and brief that it seemed less like a tick of time lay between the moment I placed myself in Professor Hildebrand's strange machine and the instant when I found myself standing upright in the clear sunlight that flooded a broad plain. I could not doubt that I had indeed been transported to another world. The landscape was not so grotesque and fantastic as I might have supposed, but it was indisputably alien to anything existing on Earth. But before I gave much heed to my surroundings, I examined my own person to learn if I had survived that awful flight without injury. Apparently I had. My various parts functioned with their accustomed vigor, but I was naked. Hildebrand had told me that inorganic substances could not survive the transmutation. Only vibrant, living matter could pass unchanged between the unthinkable gulfs which lie between the planets. I was grateful I had not fallen into a land of ice and snow. The plain seemed filled with a lazy, summer-like heat. The warmth of the sun was pleasant on my bare limbs. On every side stretched away a vast, level plain, thickly grown with short green grass. In the distance this grass attained a greater height, and through it I caught the glint of water. Here and there throughout the plain this phenomenon was repeated, and I traced the meandering course of several rivers, apparently of no great width. Black dots moved through the grass near the rivers, but their nature I could not determine. However, it was quite evident that my lot had not been cast on an uninhabited planet, though I could not guess the nature of the inhabitants. My imagination peopled the distances with nightmare shapes. It is an awesome sensation to be suddenly hurled from one's native world into a new, strange alien sphere. To say that I was not appalled at the prospect, that I did not shrink and shudder in spite of the peaceful quiet of my environs, would be hypocrisy. I, who had never known fear, was transformed into a mass of quivering, cowering nerves, starting at my own shadow. It was that man's utter helplessness that was borne upon me, and my mighty frame of massive thews seemed frail and brittle as the body of a child. How could I pit them against an unknown world? In that instant I would gladly have returned to earth and the gallows that awaited me, rather than face the nameless terrors with which imagination peopled my new-found world. But I would soon learn that those thews I now despised were capable of carrying me through greater perils than I dreamed. A slight sound brought me around to stare amazedly at the first inhabitant of ALMURIC I was to encounter. And the sight, awesome and menacing as it was, yet drove the ice from my veins and brought back some of my dwindling courage. The tangible and material can never be as grisly as the unknown, however perilous. At my first startled glance I thought it was a gorilla which stood before me. Even with the thought, I realized it was a man, but such a man as either I or any other Earthman had ever looked upon. He was not much taller than I, but broader and heavier, with a great spread of shoulders and thick limbs knotted with muscles. He wore a loincloth of some silk-like material, girdled with a broad belt which supported a long knife in a leather sheath. High-strapped sandals were on his feet. These details I took in at a glance, my attention being instantly fixed in fascination on his face. Such a countenance it is difficult to imagine or describe. The head was set squarely between massive shoulders, the neck so squat as to be scarcely apparent. The jaw was square and powerful, and the wide, thin lips lifted in a snarl. I glimpsed brutal, tusk-like teeth. A short, bristly beard masked the jaw, set off by fierce, up-curving mustaches. The nose was almost rudimentary, with wide, flaring nostrils. The eyes were small, bloodshot, and an icy gray in color. From the thick black brows, the forehead, low and receding, sloped down to a tangle of coarse, bushy hair. The ears were small and very close set. The mane and beard were a very blue-black, and the creature's limbs and body were almost covered with hair of the same hue. He was not, indeed, as hairy as an ape, but he was hairier than any human being I had ever seen. I instantly realized that the being, hostile or not, was a formidable figure. He fairly emanated strength, hard, raw, brutal power. There was not an ounce of surplus flesh on him. His frame was massive, with heavy bones. His hairy skin rippled with muscles that looked iron-hard. Yet it was not altogether his body that spoke of dangerous power. His look, his carriage, his whole manner reflected a terrible physical might backed by a cruel and implacable mind. As I met the blaze of his bloodshot eyes, I felt a wave of corresponding anger. The stranger's attitude was arrogant and provocative beyond description. I felt my muscles tense and harden instinctively. But for an instant my resentment was submerged by the amazement with which I heard him speak in perfect English. "Thack! What manner of man are you?" His voice was harsh, grating and insulting. There was nothing subdued or restrained about him. Here were the naked primitive instincts and manners, unmodified. Again I felt the old red fury rising in me, but I fought it down. "I am Esau Karn," I said shortly, and halted, at a loss to explain my presence on his planet. His arrogant eyes roved contemptuously over my hairless limbs and smooth face, and when he spoke, it was with unbearable scorn. "By Thack, are you a man or a woman?" My answer was a smash of my clenched fist that sent him rolling on the sward. The act was instinctive. Again my primitive wrath had betrayed me. But I had no time for self-reproach. With a scream of bestial rage, my enemy sprang up and rushed at me, roaring and frothing. I met him breast to breast, as reckless in my wrath as he, in an instant, was fighting for my life. I, who had always had to restrain and hold down my strength lest I injure my fellow man, for the first time in my life found myself in the clutches of a man stronger than myself. This I realized in the first instant of impact, and it was only by the most desperate efforts that I fought clear of his crushing embrace. The fight was short and deadly. The only thing that saved me was the fact that my antagonist knew nothing of boxing. He could, and did, strike powerful blows with his clenched fist, but they were clumsy, ill-timed, and erratic. Thrice I mauled my way out of grapples that would have ended with the snapping of my spine. He had no knack for avoiding blows. No man on earth would have survived the terrible battering I gave him. Yet he incessantly surged in on me, his mighty hands spread to drag me down. His nails were almost like talons, and I was quickly bleeding from a score of places where they had torn the skin. Why he had not drawn his dagger I could not understand, unless it was because he considered himself capable of crushing me with his bare hands, which proved to be the case. At last, half blinded by my smashes, blood gushing from his split ears and splintered teeth, he did reach for his weapons, and the move won the fight for me. Breaking out of a half-clinch, he straightened out of his defensive crouch and drew his dagger. As he did so, I hooked my left into his belly with all the might of my heavy shoulders and powerful driving legs behind it. The breath went out of him in an explosive gasp, and my fist sank to the wrist in his belly. He swayed, his mouth flying open, and I smashed my right into his sagging jaw. The punch started at my hip and carried every ounce of my weight and strength. He went down like a slaughtered ox and lay without twitching, blood spreading out over his beard. That last smash had torn his lip open from the corner of his mouth to the rim of his chin. It must have surely fractured his jawbone as well.
Now for our new book, and it's a banger of a history. This show explores the best in epic fantasy and sword and sorcery, old and new, and no better book might be found today that tells the tale of the latter than Flames and Crimson, A History of Sword and Sorcery by Brian Murphy. Brian Murphy's thorough study of the genre combining low fantasy, elements of horror and history, as well as plentiful secondary worlds, weaves a fascinating tale from Howard's Conan to Lieber's Fafner and Grey Mouser, The Rise of Sword and Soul, all the way to today's luminaries like Hanuvar by Howard Andrew Jones. Immensely readable, this is a thoughtful examination, never shying from the nicks in the genre's blade where it struck poorly, but quick to show how a new edge has been honed to help fight our way forward, carrying Sword and Sorcery into the 21st century. Let's read from Flame and Crimson by Brian Murphy. Taken from Chapter 1, page 9 of Brian Murphy's Flame and Crimson, A History of Sword and Sorcery. This section is entitled Sword and Sorcery, The Base Elements. Anyone who has seen the Frank Frazetta painting Death Dealer, or watched Conan the Barbarian, has a good starting visual for Sword and Sorcery. Harder to define are its literary, stylistic, and thematic elements and characteristics. This next section offers a working ground floor definition. While placing rigid borders around anything as malleable as literature results in exceptions and contradictions, Sword and Sorcery fiction has a distinctive aesthetic and conventions. While no story is likely to contain all these elements, it typically features men, and occasionally women, of action, pitted against enemies wielding dark and dangerous magic in pursuit of personal and or mercenary aims. Story and page-turning adventure is privileged over in-depth characterization or world-building. Sword and Sorcery is rooted in pulp adventure stories and weird horror, a legacy of its weird tales ancestry and the formidable influence of H.P. Lovecraft. Is inspired by history, and in particular owes much to historical fiction, adventure fiction, and Icelandic saga. Typically is short, more at home in short stories or novella-length works. Finally, its heroes are often outsiders, uncomfortable in positions of great authority and ill-fitted to the civilized mores of the lands through which they adventure. When they do find themselves in leadership positions, Sword and Sorcery heroes often find the crown heavy and wearying, apt to swap it out for coin to fuel their next binge of drinking and wenching. They are ever attuned to the siren call of dangerous but lucrative adventure, a call which they frequently answer. Following is a closer look at these elements, citing examples from representative Sword and Sorcery fiction from approximately 1929 through 1988. This period coincides with the subgenre's beginning, defined as the publication of Robert E. Howard's The Shadow Kingdom, and its approximate fall. The latter date is subjective and somewhat arbitrary, as Sword and Sorcery never utterly collapsed or vanished, but by the late 1980s it had largely ceased to be handled by mainstream publishers. Not every Sword and Sorcery story contains each of the following elements, nor is in some set proportion or formula. These are intended as broad strokes to help provide a working definition, and will be found in varying degrees in the literature. In recent years, authors working in the tradition have deliberately struck out to break Sword and Sorcery's conventions, forging new ground as they challenge the reader's expectations and push the subgenre into new and interesting territory. Pondering the Orb would be nothing without its music, and this season we're continuing to highlight the best of melodic death metal and synthwave. As you can tell, we have a new theme song, which is also our selection for this episode. Returning to the show and graciously allowing this track to serve as Pondering the Orb's official theme, Overcrest is an electronic musician and producer out of Fayetteville, Arkansas, who is dazzling the synth world right now with his debut album, Back Again, one of the albums of the summer. Let's shine as we pass through Shadows and Streetlights, taken from Overcrest's 2023 album, Back Again. So many bands of melodic death metal deserve so much more attention than they get, and we're here today to shine a light on an amazing six-piece from Clifton, New Jersey. Formed in 2013, Dead City Crown have become local heroes on the East Coast metal scene, thrilling with a collection of sizzling EPs that should be required listening for any modern melodic death metal fan. Combining high-velocity rhythms and a dueling guitar sound always required for this wonderful genre since its infancy, and fronted by an infinitely compelling frontman in Carl Conquest, Dead City Crown is set to take over the world one day. It's not a question of if, but when. But now it's time to grind, with Autumn's May by Dead City Crown, taken from the 2020 EP, Our Blood Apocolyptic. I'll see you at the end.
We swallow the story about it and more than we know.
Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Pondering the Orb. Please check out all the books and music below in the description. Hey, my new book Atinia is available in paperback. Click on the link below and pick up this great epic fantasy currently in the running for self-publishing fantasy blog off 9. And please, if you enjoyed this, subscribe and click on the notification button, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with more books and music. Until then, safe journeys.